Okay, we are finally starting on Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail 1972. I don't know how many of you may have already read this or be familiar with it. I've just went through the introduction, and I'm going to be doing this differently than I did the Judge Gray book, which was more reading and pulling out quotes and points, because it was that sort of book. This is much more narrative. It's not didactic teaching type of book. So I have, and there's some wonderful black and white photos in here. I don't think there's any color ones, but there's a bunch of black and white photos. Now, in having gone through the introduction, I did highlight some things that I wanted to cover. So, excuse me, had too much soda. So it's not going to be entirely devoid of quotes, but I wanted to talk more about the general narrative. Now, the book is set up by, you're not going to be able to see that with this lighting, by month. So it starts from December 71, and then each chapter is a different month, except for there's a couple in which a month has actually two chapters, like March, later in March, June, later in June. And it goes through November, which is the election. Actually, through December, excuse me. And there is an epitaph. So, in the introduction, what immediately struck me about the introduction, and those of you who are much younger won't get this, and I don't mean you'll like intellectually understand what I'm saying, but you don't live through that time. And I was a child, but I still remember a lot of the cultural zeitgeist pretty well, and just the general attitude. I had an older brother and sister, and their friends would be over, you know, they were teenagers in high school at the time. So I got to observe a lot of cultural attitudes of people older than myself. And I can tell you back then, the culture was much more blasé about sex and drug use. And that's immediately what jumps out at me. And I actually found it somewhat refreshing. I don't think we should be uptight about either subject. But that can be shocking, I think, to people today who don't realize how different things used to be. So while the author is talking about, because this is the author's note or the preface, or introduction, whatever you want to call it, I think they call it author's note in here. So he's talking about when he was coming up on the deadline for this book, and how the publisher like pulled him away in like isolation almost. You got to finish this book. And he said, on one afternoon about 3 days ago, they showed up at my door with no warning and loaded about 40 pounds of supplies into the room. 2 cases of Mexican beer, 4 quarts of gin, a dozen grapefruits, and enough speed to alter the outcome of 6 Super Bowls. I remember that time, man. The speed and the cocaine ran freely. Says there was also a big Selectric typewriter, no computers then, 2 reams of paper, a face cord of oak firewood, and 3 tape recorders in case the situation got so desperate that I might have to resort to verbal composition. And that paragraph to me really summed up kind of the age, you know? So, he says, see here he says it goes from December 71 to January 73, even though the last chapter is December. And he talked about his different attitude from other political correspondents that were covering this campaign, because they did that as their career. You know, this wasn't the last campaign they were going to cover. So they had to carefully cultivate sources, be very diplomatic, not burn bridges, but he had the freedom to kind of buck all of those and go gonzo. So he said, when I went to Washington, I was determined to avoid this kind of trap. Unlike most other correspondents, I could afford to burn all of my bridges behind me because I was only there for a year, and the last thing I cared about was establishing long-term connections on Capitol Hill. I went there for 2 reasons. 1, to learn as much as possible about the mechanics and realities of a presidential campaign, and 2, to write about it the same way I'd write about anything else, as close to the bone as I could get, and to hell with the consequences. A man after my own heart. I tend to say what I want, and to hell with the consequences as well. And I'm not in the situation where I can always afford to, but I do it anyway. So he closes his introduction with, meanwhile, my room at the Seal Rock Inn is filling up with people who seem on the verge of hysteria at the sight of me still sitting here, wasting time on a rambling introduction with the final chapter still unwritten and the presses scheduled to start rolling in 24 hours. But unless someone shows up pretty soon with some extremely powerful speed, there might not be any final chapter. About 4 fingers on King Hill crank would do the trick, but I am not optimistic. There is a definite scarcity of genuine high-voltage crank on the market these days, and according to recent statements by official spokesmen for the Justice Department in Washington, there's solid evidence of our progress in the war against dangerous drugs. Oh, boy. So yeah, that's it for the intro, which I really enjoyed. So we will proceed to December 1971. And I like this picture in the beginning here of the Capitol. Do not enter. Yeah. And just to give you an idea. Oh, what's that? Yeah. It's one of these old carbon receipts where it's completely faded. Let me see if I can see anything about this. This would have been the prior owner of this book. Wow, this book came from Fort Myers, Florida. I'm originally from Florida. He paid, I think this was a used bookstore. No, wow. He paid a lot for this. He paid well, this might not have been the only book purchased. No, there were 2 books purchased. He spent $14.50 on this book. I spent less, got it used. Doesn't look like it was even read, though, to be honest with you. But he bought another book, so it was a bit over $30. And the other book was, and I'm saying he, I have no idea, American Psycho. Barnes & Noble. And I don't think it has a name. And wasn't a member, because it says a member would have saved. Paid $2 in cash and the rest with credit card. That's really weird, isn't it? And he bought it on February 26, 2008. And the cashier was Paul. This is about to just fade away. But what I wanted to look at is how long are these chapters? Well, December goes from page 9 to page 24. That's not bad. Let's look in the index here to see how long most of them are. And have you ever read that book called How to Read a Book? Which is funny. And I like the joke of the sequel, it's How to Read a Second Book. But it gives you really good skills on digesting books and tells you to skim first, get a feel for the lay of the land, really examine the table of contents. And I find a lot of people don't do that, and it's very useful. But let's see. So here, it looks like most of the chapters are 20 pages or under. Between April and May is longer. Between June and later in June is longer. But on average, about 20 pages, it seems. Ooh, this is a big one. August is maybe 50 pages. Yeah, that's a big one. But okay. And the, well, I won't go into the titles that are in December 71. We will do that next time. I really would enjoy it if you were also reading this. Bye-bye.